Hello, welcome to the shed. In today's video, we're going to be following on from last week's video of how to get a precision cross cut every time. Today, we're going to be doing the rip cut and how to get a perfect rip cut every time. So stay tuned and we'll get to it. So there are a few things that we have to cover before we get into rip cutting. This video does follow on from the beginner series that I've been carrying out here, and just like last week's video, this video covers your handsaw, obviously rip cut tooth. We also need to know how to sharpen your saw to do that, so I'll leave the sharpening video down below for that, and also the introduction to handsaw video. And we also want to be including the marking gauge, and obviously if you're using one of these wheel marking gauges, how to sharpen that wheel as well. So I'll leave those links down below for you as well. In the last video, if you saw that, I showed you that we need to point the finger to actually keep the tenon saw straight. That is just a very small amount of what you need to do. We need to look at handsaw technique. Now, pointing the finger is one of the main parts of that technique, and you can get away with using a back saw doing that because it's generally closer up work and you're not going through a long cut and your blade is fixed. So when we move to a panel saw, whether that is a cross-cut panel saw or a rip-cut panel saw, we need to keep some sort of alignment in our body while we're hand sawing. Now, we do point our finger. We want to keep our wrist in alignment with our elbow, and those two in alignment with our shoulder. So when we're hand sawing, we want to keep that straight movement. Even if you do need to move your body out of the way a little bit so you can get that straight, that's what you need to do. Wrist, finger pointed, so you lock that wrist almost. Elbow in alignment. Now you can use the side of your body to keep that alignment so you roughly know where it is. So your elbow is not going like this, because a lot of the problems that you have when hand sawing is that the elbow starts moving. And so we want to keep the wrist to elbow and shoulder in alignment and move like this. Before you get into rip sawing, you can just get this and just practice a little bit with that alignment and practice keeping yourself in alignment, because as soon as your elbow starts going, the whole saw goes like this, and if you're not got your finger on your wrist, you're all over the place. So you want to practice that perfect technique, and it's kind of like you're creating a jig with your body for the saw to work correctly. That is the main and first thing we want to cover, is the technique. So now we've got that out of the way, let's get to the piece of wood that we're going to be using. I'm just going to be ripping this little bit of pointer width. So let me bring in here and we'll mark our line with our marking gauge, and then we'll get to sawing and I'll show you how I go about doing that. For the sake of this piece of wood, I'm just going to come up with an arbitrary amount that we're going to obviously use our marking gauge on. And obviously, if you're doing a piece of work, you know how wide it is, so you know exactly what marking you're going to have to do. Just like in the video on how to use these properly, make sure you got it engaged and run through lightly a couple of times, and then get heavier. And we want to mark both sides of the board. Now, it's vitally important with the technique I'm going to show you is that you mark both sides of the board, and you'll see that in a minute as to why. Just mark these pencil lines in. So penciling the line in will allow you to see it a little easier, which you probably want to be doing just so you know where it is. Depending on the wood, you might want to use a white pencil if you're using a dark wood. And the reason we use the marking gauge is that's giving us a very definitive line, just like the knife line did when we were cross-cutting. We've got that definitive line so we know exactly where we need to be, and I'll explain later as to why we've got that. So for now, we just want that line so we can use our eye and see exactly which side of that line we're staying on. Now with this, what you want to do is mark the side that is waste. So in this case, this thin piece is the waste, that's what I'm removing, and you want to mark that. And it doesn't really matter how, just so you know, crosses, squiggles, anything. So we know we're going to remove this piece here, and that's what we're going to do. So I'm going to jump down into the vise now, and for such a small piece like this, I'll saw it in the vise. If you've got a saw bench and you're using longer pieces, you can do the same technique, which is a little bit easier if it's down lower and you can actually kneel and use your body weight to clamp it. However, for the purpose of this, I'm going to do it in the vise because a lot of you are probably going to be working on small pieces if you're doing boxes and other smaller projects. So into the vise. You'll notice just here, and I'll bring you in closer in a minute when we get to the detailed work, but I've got my piece of wood on an angle. Now the reason for that angle is, it'll become apparent when we start, but I'm just going to explain why I angle the piece of wood. Now when I'm cross cutting, you'll notice that I liked for the heel of the saw to drop first, so you're kind of on an angle and you're referencing right across your line the whole way, and you've got a better reference because it's on an angle. It also means the sawing angle changes a little bit and the approach for the saw to the wood, it's a little less aggressive and it goes through the wood just that little bit easier. When we're ripping like this, if we angle the piece of wood, and you know how I was talking about how we keep everything in alignment, all you have to concentrate on doing is not angling your saw. You can just concentrate on going straight back and forwards, doing what you've always done, and the equivalent of dropping the heel of your saw is done for you. So angling your piece of wood makes this process a lot easier, and if you had it frontwards in your vise, which I do sometimes, and you've probably seen me do that in some of my videos, you then have to drop your hand as you're going and it becomes a little more awkward, especially with your jaw vise in the way. We're using a rip saw here. This saw is, I believe, about 7 teeth per inch. So it's not a very fine one. It's not particularly aggressive, but it's sharp, good to go, and I find 7 to 10 teeth per inch works quite well for doing small work at the bench. We have our line situated right here. Now, what we want to do is cut next to this line as close as you can, and if you're not that comfortable with your sawing, you can actually just saw a little bit further away. So the process we're going to do here is we're going to saw this piece off, and then we're going to hand plane down to that line, which is why that marking gauge line you can see there is a very definitive line, and you can use that when hand planing to know that you've got exactly to where you want to go, to the exact thickness that you used your marking gauge to mark on your board. So in order to start this, I'm just going to show you how we do a pinch hold. So we come in like this and we're going to pinch on that line. So I'm on the top corner just here and the bottom corner with my thumb, and the idea is that when you pinch it like this, you're going just along that line, and then you can start next to that line, just like this with that pinch. So with these long saws, starting can be a little bit tricky. Since this saw cuts on the push stroke, we're going to start and we're going to pull back. Then we can see just here that it's formed a little divot on the board, and I can drop the saw straight back into that. So we're pinching here, squeezing that pinch so it's pushing. So if I start right on this line and I put my fingers up next to it and I squeeze them, it pushes it across, and that's where it's dropped into that little notch that we already did to start. So to recap, pull towards you a couple of times to start the saw, and then you can start sawing like this. That's relatively easy, and you also want to be checking as you're sawing that you're actually staying square across the top here against that line as well. But because we started on that angle, it was nearly always going to go straight, but it's a good thing just to double check when you're first learning that your saw line is actually coming through where you want it. The process going forward from here is to continue like this, and then you go a little way, and then I'll show you what we get up to. And you can keep your thumb here the whole time, just as a little guide to stopping the saw wanting to come back this way, because they can flex back. Now, I've gone about a third of the way here now on this small piece. Usually, if I'm sawing on a much longer board, I'll just go until the saw hits where the table's going to be, and I've got to readjust it to do this step. So, to make sure that we're keeping square, we're then going to turn the board over the other way. And if we look here, you can see there's this little string that's come off, and that's from the saw pushing the fibres forwards. Because we've got a sort of chisel shape on this saw, these are the fibres that it kind of just pushes forwards out of the way onto this side. And you can see here that I'm still straight by that line because we've used pretty good technique, but you can wobble on this far side. So the idea is that you bring it around like this, back into the vise, and you then start this side, and you've got to remember you're now on the opposite side of your line. So I was on this side of the line, closest to the camera. Now I'm on my side. Now, when you've turned this way, you can't really do that pinch anymore, but now that you've established a curve, and it's on an angle, you already have everything set up that you need. So you can just come in from this side, saw down until I stop here, flip the board over again. Each time you bring it up a little bit higher until you get right down to the bottom where you can't actually saw because it's held in your vise. So you can see I'm now down in line with the jaws of my vise here. So I can't saw any further here. So what I'm going to do is turn it over so I have the exact same sort of bit left that I don't need, that I still have to saw on this side. So now both sides are in line with the vise like this. So there are a couple of ways in which you can saw through that last little bit. You can turn it up the other way in your vise like this and just start again. You can sometimes clamp it off the side or hold it off the side of your vise like this and saw down. As a beginner, this is the way I like to do it, and that is clamp it into your vise and then just continue sawing in that same curve that you've already got that's established your nice straight line for sawing. Once you get more confident in your sawing, you can definitely bring it back into your vise, and for this stage I like to just clamp it flat. I can get it right to the right height. I don't really need to angle my saw, and you can actually just come straight in and saw down to it. But for today, I'm going to show you the easiest way, and that's sawing in the curve that you've already got established. So we're just locking it in the edge of our vise, hanging off the side of our bench. And if you're doing this on a saw bench, you can literally just hold your piece of wood and just saw right through nearly every time. Depending on how wide the board is, you can. Now, I don't have a lot of room here, so just bear in mind that if you don't have a lot of room, this process can be a little more tricky, but I've got just enough to keep my alignment here and saw through this. So if we have a close look at this board, I don't know if you can see that because that line is a little bit faint, but the line is intact right along this edge here. And it's intact right along that edge. So you can see we've sawed down there with correct technique and kept a nice straight line along there. So the next process, you guessed it, is to put it back into the vise and hand plane down to that line. And that's where the definitive line of the marking gauge, particularly a cutting gauge, leaves a nice definitive line that you can then hand plane to. And you can see when you're getting very close to that, it gives us a very definitive area, so we know which end we need to start on if there's more to come off one end than the other, because we've not cut this dead straight as we would like. We're not machines after all, and if you want that kind of accuracy, table saws are the way to go, not hand saws. But we're doing hand saws here, so we don't have an even cut on this board. So we can see where there's more than others, and we can start to correct that with the hand plane. You can use absolutely any hand plane for doing this. Obviously, based on the length of your timber, you're going to choose a longer sole or a shorter sole. I'm just going to keep using the new Stanley Bailey as we have with the replacement Lubin blade, because that's what happens to be in here in sharp. We want to take a very fine cut because we don't want to take too much material off. So we want to run through a few times and get a bearing of how square we are to our line and where material needs to be taken off. So it's a little bit high on this end down here. So you do a couple of extra passes there. If it's going the way you like, now I'm going against the grain here. I can hear it in the sound of it. It's kind of just chipping a little bit more than I'd like. You can still see the line just here. We've got no line back here, which means we've already got to depth on that side and on this side down to about here. So we're a little bit out of square. So we're going to take one run on that side to try and correct that. And we're just going to slowly nibble our way through. We're still a little bit out of square just up this end. So you're coming straight down until that line just disappears. And sometimes when you've used the cutting gauge, you get a little fairy piece here. And that's when you know you've got right on top of that line. You can still see a little bit of the marking gauge there. Marking gauge is completely gone on this side, which means we're just a little bit out of square on this side of it. So you'll want to square that across and check it with your square, and then you're done. So you can see the reasoning for using both the cutting gauge and the pencil makes it easier for both steps in this process. So there you go, folks. That's how you rip cut with some degree of accuracy. If you'd like a little bit more accuracy, which I don't think is 100% necessary, but it's nice sometimes, is that you create my long range shooting board. I'll leave the link to that video below, and that is where you bring your board in like this and you reference off your bench. As long as your bench is square, you're going to have no problems, and you can run your hand plane along there to square up if you're a little bit worried with the freehand planing. So if you like this video, please consider liking and subscribing. It really does help me out more than you know. And if you'd like to support me a little bit further, please consider checking me out on Patreon. And while you're down there liking and subscribing, if you're logged into your account, you'll see that I've got this new super thanks thing under all my videos. That's where you can donate a small monetary amount if you got some value out of the video. I'd very much appreciate that. And if you'd like some more videos like this, check the video out here to the cross-cutting a board with precision and also the beginner playlist. Bye for now.